in Matthew 15:3, Jesus had indicted the Pharisees and scribes for teaching the wrong thing. So that would show you immediately that when he said in chapter 23, do everything the scribes and Pharisees tell you to do, they're sitting in the seat of Moses, that's quickly and immediately qualified by what he said in 15:3. Why are you transgressing God's commandment? Because of your tradition. So Jesus was very critical. In fact, he gave 7 woes, curses at the end, about how bad the Pharisees were. So when he says you should do what they tell you to do, if it's correct in terms of the law of Moses, that's what Jesus was proposing at that time. And gradually, though, and even in the ministry of Jesus, he himself qualified that obedience to Moses and introduces the new covenant. So please understand, there are 2 covenants. The old covenant is not the same as the new. So I would simply say that Jesus qualifies that statement in Matthew 23, way back there in Matthew, in many places. You can do what those Pharisees told you to do if in fact they are proclaiming the law of Moses correctly. But even that is not the fullness of Christianity, because as time developed, Jesus himself said, there's something beyond the Old Testament. So that's a limited statement, and it's qualified by Jesus himself in Matthew. So what I'd like you to get out of this is there are 2 covenants in the New Testament. Jesus is said to be the mediator of, guess what? The new covenant. You'll find that in Hebrews 9:15, 8:6, and 12:24. Jesus was the mediator of the new covenant, not the old. So to say that Jesus was just copying the law of Moses is absolutely fatal. You've got the wrong Jesus. Jesus was the bringer and institutor of the new covenant. You'll find that 3 times in Hebrews. Paul was also the minister of the new covenant in 2 Corinthians 3:6. So I'll give those verses again, Hebrews 9:15, 8:6, and 12:24, and 2 Corinthians 3:6. Both Paul and Jesus were expressly and explicitly ministers of the new covenant. Therefore, they were not just preaching what Moses preached. So if you think you ought to be keeping the Sabbath on Saturday, because that's what it commands in the Old Testament, if you think you ought to be physically circumcising your children, male children, for religious reasons, if you believe that, you are much mistaken. You are not to try to mix the covenants. The Sabbath keeping, the obligatory Sabbath keeping, the calendar, was a sign of, get this, the old covenant, not the new. Colossians 2:16, Paul says, don't let anybody try to persuade you to keep the Sabbath on Saturday, or the holy days, or the new moons, or to argue about which foods are clean and which are unclean. That's all finished. That's under the law of Moses. So this issue of the covenants and which law you're under is absolutely essential. We spent the whole hour dealing with this, but I hope you got enough to see that both Jesus and Paul were ministers not of Moses at all. They were ministers of the new covenant, which is not the same as the law of Moses.
Yes, Jesus says in verse 2 and 3, the Pharisees are the teachers of Moses. By the way, the chair as in authority, I don't believe there was an actual chair of Moses, but I think it's just a figurative way of speaking about the authority of Moses. So, and Jesus says, listen to them, do what they tell you. Don't do what they do because they're hypocrites, but do what they tell you. Now, what are they telling the people? Well, they're telling the law of Moses. That is true. But as Anthony is saying here, if you go on to this chapter, this is the famous woes. Sir Anthony has translated woes there as shame. So sort of shame on you, teachers. So then he shames them 7 times, I believe. But then towards the end here, Anthony, is something interesting. He says in verse 34, that is why, because these people are shameful, they're hypocrites, this is why I will send you prophets, wise men, scholars or rabbis, teachers. So this is interesting. Jesus says, yes, listen to them, but then they're such hypocrites and shameful hypocrites that I myself will send you teachers. If we're honest with the text and with the sayings of Jesus, Jesus did not just come to repeat Moses. His teachings are different, very different. Sometimes he overturns the food laws, for example. So he's obviously not in line completely with Moses. It doesn't mean he throws away the law of Moses altogether, by the way. He does ask the young rich man, for example, well, have you obeyed the commandments? So those commandments are still viable for the Christian church today. But the question has to do with the whole law of Moses. Is Jesus just repeating Moses? We don't believe he is, as most of Christianity believes. So then if Jesus says, I will send my own rabbis, my own teachers, well, they won't sound like Moses.